The cold had teeth that night. It bit through the thin wool of Rose's cloak, crept beneath her collar, and settled into her bones with the patience of something that had always lived there. She moved quickly along the edge of the frozen river, her boots cracking through a crust of ice that had formed over the mud, each step louder than she wanted it to be. The pine forest on either side of the path swallowed the moonlight, leaving only shifting shadows and the distant howl of wind through bare branches. She was not supposed to be out here. No Omega was permitted beyond the village boundary after the bell of second dark. It was not a law written in scrolls or proclaimed by a herald. It was simply the way things were, the kind of rule that lived in the shoulders of women like her, pressed down so long it felt like bone. But the herb she needed did not grow within the boundary, and the man back in the healer's cottage had a fever that was climbing fast enough to frighten her. Rose pulled her cloak tighter and kept moving. She had her satchel over one shoulder, worn leather, soft with age, and inside it, wrapped in linen, were the cuttings she'd already gathered: feverwort, pale and sharp-smelling, and 2 stems of blood moss she'd scraped off a riverside stone. What she still needed was wolfsbane root, which only grew near the frozen creek bed another quarter-mile north, where the soil stayed dark even in winter. She was almost there when she heard it. Not an animal sound, not wind. A breath, ragged, forced, the sound of someone fighting to stay conscious. Rose stopped. She turned slowly toward the sound, her eyes adjusting to the darkness between the pines. There was something large on the ground near the base of a great oak. For a moment she thought it was a fallen branch, or perhaps a stag that had wandered too close to the cold and collapsed. But then it moved. A shift of weight, a low groan that was distinctly, painfully human. She stepped closer. The man was enormous. Even crumpled against the roots of the oak, his frame was wider than any she had seen in the village, the kind of build that came from years of warfare and command. He wore armor, black leather with iron rivets along the chest, cross straps still buckled tight. But the left side of his torso told a different story. The leather there had been sliced clean through, and beneath it, a wound gaped dark and deep, soaking through the padding underneath and dripping steadily onto the frozen ground. His hair was braided back in dark ropes that had come half loose, falling across his face and shoulders. His skin was pale from blood loss, and when Rose crouched beside him, she could see his jaw was clenched so tightly the muscles in his neck stood out like cord. His eyes opened. They were blue, not the soft blue of winter sky, but the hard electric blue of lightning caught in ice, and they fixed on her with an intensity that made her breath stop in her chest. "Go," he said. His voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried the weight of a command so deeply practiced it had become instinct. "Leave. Now." Rose did not move. She set down her satchel and opened it. "You're bleeding through your armor," she said, her own voice steadier than she felt. "If I leave, you'll be dead before the moon moves another hand's width." Something crossed his face. Not gratitude, not relief. Something closer to fury at his own helplessness. "I said leave." "And I heard you," Rose replied, already pulling out the clean linen strips she carried for exactly this kind of emergency, though in her years of quiet healing work, she had never imagined using them on someone who looked like this. "I'm choosing not to obey." The silence that followed was startling. He stared at her. She met his gaze for only a moment before dropping her focus back to the wound, which was exactly where her attention needed to be. The cut was long, 4 fingers wide, deep into the muscle beneath his ribs. Whatever had made it had been a serious blade, not a hunting knife. She could smell iron and something else beneath the blood, a trace of silver, faint but unmistakable, the kind that would slow a wolf's healing to nearly nothing. Silver-edged blade. This had not been an accident. "This was an assassination attempt," she said quietly, not as an accusation, simply as an observation. He said nothing, which was confirmation enough. Rose worked without speaking after that. She packed the wound with feverwort. It would sting, she knew, and true enough. She felt him flinch even through the controlled stillness he held his body in. And then she bound the linen around his torso, tight enough to hold, looping it beneath his arm with the efficiency of someone who had done this many times before in smaller, quieter ways. Her fingers were cold, but they were steady. They were always steady when she worked. When she finished, she sat back on her heels and looked at him. The furious tension in his face had eased slightly. Whether from the binding or from something else, she could not say. His blue eyes were watching her with an expression she couldn't name. Something that held both suspicion and a strange, reluctant attention. The way a wolf might watch a creature it had decided for the moment was not prey. "You're still losing blood," she said. "Slowly now, but you can't stay on the ground. There's a cottage a quarter-mile south. My cottage. You need to come with me." "I will not enter an Omega's dwelling," he said. The words were said without cruelty, with the flat certainty of a man who had never questioned such things, but they landed between them like a dropped stone. Rose looked at him for a long moment. Then she picked up her satchel and stood. "Then stay here," she said simply. "But you won't survive until morning, and I won't carry the weight of that on my conscience." She turned south and began walking. She had counted 7 steps when she heard, behind her, the slow and agonized sound of a very large, very proud man pulling himself up from the frozen ground. She didn't turn around to look. She simply kept walking and listened to the footsteps that followed her through the dark. Heavy, uneven, but present. He followed her, and that, though neither of them knew it yet, was where everything began. Inside the cottage, the fire had burned low. Rose pushed the door open and crossed immediately to the hearth, feeding it 2 fresh logs and coaxing the coals back to life. The small space filled with orange light. A single room, clean and carefully ordered, with shelves of dried herbs hanging from the low ceiling, bundles of root and bark arranged in clay pots, a narrow bed against the far wall, a rough table in the center, and a stool that she pushed toward the fire for him. He stood in the doorway. He filled it completely. The frame was not built for a man of his height, and he had to tilt his head slightly as he stepped inside. And even then the black fur at his shoulders brushed the wood. He looked around the cottage with an expression that was carefully unreadable, taking in every detail with those ice-blue eyes. And Rose had the sudden, distinct impression that nothing escaped his notice. She set a clay pot of water over the fire without asking his name. She already suspected she knew it. She had heard the name spoken in the village for years, always in low voices, always with that particular blend of reverence and fear that people reserved for forces of nature. She had seen his banner once, when the royal procession passed through the valley road below the village. A black wolf on silver ground, carried by outriders with iron shields. King Roman of Ashenvale, the Alpha King of the Northern Reaches. The man who had ended the border wars, crushed 2 rebellions, and was said to be the most powerful shifter born in 3 generations. He was sitting on her 3-legged stool, bleeding onto her floor, and watching her with eyes that had not softened even slightly. "Your name," he said. "Rose," she answered, without looking up from the pot. Another long silence. "You knew who I was," he said. It was not a question. "I had a suspicion," she said. It didn't change what needed to be done. She heard something then, a sound so small she almost missed it beneath the crackling fire. It might have been the groan of old wood settling. It might have been something else entirely. It sounded, just barely, like the beginning of something he had not intended to say. Word count. 512. Fiquei pouco abaixo do mínimo. Deixa eu continuar diretamente para completar os 800 palavras mínimas. Rose ladled the heated water into a wooden bowl and brought it to the table beside him, then pulled a small clay jar from the shelf, rendered fat mixed with powdered blood moss and dried pine resin, a salve she kept for wounds that wouldn't close cleanly. She set it open beside the bowl. "I need to clean it properly," she said. The fever wort was a temporary measure. If the silver residue stays in the wound, your body won't be able to begin healing even after it's dressed. He looked at the jar, then at her. You know silver wound treatment. I know many things that Omegas aren't supposed to know, she said evenly. Are you going to let me work or not? For just a moment, something shifted in his expression. Not amusement precisely, but the ghost of something that had once been close to it. He said nothing, only reached up and unbuckled the cross straps of his armor, setting the chest piece aside with a heavy clank against the stone floor. Rose worked carefully, methodically, flushing the wound with clean water, and then applying the salve with a narrow wooden implement, reaching into the depth of the cut with a steadiness that required her to empty her mind of everything except the task. She was aware of his size. It was impossible not to be. But she kept her focus narrow and professional, the same way she did with any patient. When she had finished dressing it properly and had bound it with fresh linen, she stepped back. He was watching her with an expression that had changed again, settling into something that was harder to read than anger or suspicion. It was the look of a man recalibrating something fundamental. Why? He asked. Rose picked up the used linens and set them aside. Why what? Why help me? He paused. You risked the boundary rule to be out here. You risked far more by bringing me inside. An Omega who involves herself in an assassination attempt against the crown, even by treating the victim, is placing herself within reach of a great many dangerous people. His voice was quiet, but the words were precise, chosen with the deliberateness of someone who used language the way a blade is used. You must have known that. Rose looked at him steadily. I knew a man was bleeding to death in the snow, she said. That was the only thing I was thinking about. The fire crackled. Outside, wind moved through the pines. Sleep there, she said, nodding toward the narrow bed. I'll take the chair. You need to be still, or the binding will loosen. He looked at the bed. He looked at her. And then, with the careful, deliberate movement of a man who had been giving orders his entire life and found it genuinely strange to follow one, King Roman of Ashenvale lowered himself onto the narrow bed of an Omega healer in a cottage at the edge of the world. Rose settled into her chair by the dying fire, pulled her cloak around her shoulders, and closed her eyes. She told herself she would not sleep. She needed to monitor his wound through the night, check for signs of silver sickness, ensure the binding held. Those were the reasons she told herself. But there was another reason, quieter and more honest, that she did not examine too closely. She was afraid of what would come in the morning, afraid of what it meant that she had done this, afraid of the knock on the door she might hear before dawn, of other men in dark armor who came looking for what she had found. She was right to be afraid. She just didn't know yet how completely, or for how long, that night in the cold would reach forward into every part of her life that followed. She was gone before he opened his eyes. That was the first thing Roman registered when consciousness returned. Not the ache in his ribs, not the unfamiliar weight of rough linen beneath his back, not even the smell of pine smoke and dried herbs that filled the small cottage. It was the absence. The chair by the hearth was empty. The cloak that had been draped over it folded neatly across the armrest, and the fire had been built up fresh, which meant she had been there recently. But she was not there now. He sat up carefully. The wound pulled, a deep, grinding protest beneath the bandaging. But it held, and the silver sickness he had been bracing for did not come. Whatever she had applied the night before had drawn the contamination cleanly. He had felt silver wounds before. He knew exactly what it meant that he was not shaking, not burning from the inside out, not fighting the disorientation that came when a wolf's healing was poisoned at the root. She had saved his life. Completely, not partially. Not bought him a few hours, actually saved it. He stood, buckled the cross straps of his armor back into place over the fresh binding, and looked around the cottage in the gray morning light. It was a poor dwelling by any measure. The walls were stone and old timber, the floor packed earth covered in clean rushes, the ceiling low enough that he had to remain conscious of his own height. But everything in it was carefully arranged, almost obsessively ordered. Herbs sorted and labeled with small strips of bark, bearing written marks, clay pots stacked by size, a narrow shelf holding half a dozen bound manuscripts so well worn their spines had lost their color. In the corner, a small wooden chest, latched. On the table, a ceramic bowl with the residue of last night's salve, still dark inside it. He crossed to the shelf and looked at the manuscripts without touching them. A healer's compendium, a root and herb catalog, the handwriting inside cramped and precise. A bound record of treatments. He could see dates and descriptions through the open cover, stretching back years. And tucked between the last 2 volumes, barely visible, the corner of something older, the parchment darker and more fragile. He did not take it out. He turned and went to the door. Outside, the morning was pale and still. The frost on the ground undisturbed except for 2 sets of prints, his own, from the night before, still punched deep into the mud, and hers smaller, heading east toward the tree line. He followed them with his eyes. At the edge of the pines, barely visible through the low mist, she was crouching near the base of a boulder, her gray cloak spread around her like a patch of fog, her long blonde braid pulled over one shoulder as she worked at the frozen ground with a narrow iron tool. Collecting the wolfsbane root she had come out for the night before, he realized. She had come back to finish what she'd started. He watched her for a long moment. She had not heard him. Or if she had, she gave no sign. There was something extraordinarily self-contained about the way she moved. A quietness that was not timidity, but something closer to discipline. She worked with the focused, unhurried efficiency of someone who had long ago stopped expecting help with anything. He walked toward her. She heard him when he was close. She straightened and turned, and for just a moment, only a moment, he saw something cross her face before she composed it. Not fear. Something more complicated than fear. The expression of someone who has spent the night preparing for a conversation they are not sure how to have. "You should be resting," she said. "I've rested enough," he replied. He stopped a few feet from her, close enough to speak without raising his voice, and looked at her properly for the first time in daylight. She was younger than he had estimated in the dark, perhaps 3 or 4 years past 20, with light eyes the color of winter fog and skin reddened at the cheeks from the cold. Her braid had come loose at the bottom, soft pale strands escaping against the collar of her cloak. She was looking at him with an expression that was direct and measured and gave remarkably little away. "How are you feeling?" she asked. The question was so plainly practical, so entirely without performance, that it caught him slightly off guard. No title, no deference, just a healer checking on her patient. "Well enough," he said, "better than I should be." She nodded, turned back to the boulder, and resumed her work. "The salve will need to be reapplied tonight. The wound is deep enough that the outer binding might hold, but the tissue underneath will need support for another 2 days at minimum before your wolf's healing can take over." She paused, working the iron tool beneath a root. "I assume you have men who can do that, once you return." "I have a court healer," he said. "Good." She eased the root free from the frozen soil and set it in her satchel. "Then you should leave soon. The longer you remain here, the more dangerous it becomes, for both of us." There was no complaint in the words, no request for recognition or reward. She was simply stating a fact, the same way she might note that rain was coming, or a wound was infected, as though the only thing that mattered was the practical reality of the situation. Roman looked at her for a long moment. "You know who sent the men last night," he said. Her hands paused, barely, for less than a breath, and then continued moving. "I have no knowledge of court politics," she said carefully. "That isn't what I asked." She turned to face him again. Her light eyes were steady. "A silver-edged blade is not a common weapon," she said. "It requires access to both the metal and the knowledge of how to use it against your kind. That limits the pool of people considerably." She looked at him evenly. "But I am an Omega healer at the edge of a forest. What I know or suspect is of no consequence to anyone." "It is of consequence to me," Roman said. Something passed through her expression then. Not warmth exactly, but a flicker of something that had not been there before. She closed her satchel and straightened, brushing frozen soil from her fingers. "Lord Edric of Vorn," she said quietly. "He passed through this valley 10 days ago, with 30 men and 2 silversmiths among his retinue. I treated one of his servants for a broken wrist, and I heard things I was not meant to hear." She paused. "I had no way to send warning. Omegas do not send word to the crown. We are not received." The name landed in Roman's chest like a coal. Edric, his mother's cousin. A man who had sat at his council table for 6 years, who had bent his knee at every gathering, whose daughter had been proposed as a potential match for the throne not 3 months past. He had suspected. He had not wanted to be certain. Now he was certain. "You should have told someone," he said. And even as the words came out, he recognized their hollowness. She had just explained exactly why she hadn't, and he had not really been speaking to her. He had been speaking to himself. Rose picked up her satchel. "I tried," she said simply. "I sent a written account to the garrison at Westhold. The captain's response arrived 4 days later. He told me that Omegas were not permitted to lodge formal reports, and that I should speak to my pack elder if I had concerns." She met his gaze. "My pack elder is Lord Edric's appointed man." The silence that followed was very long. Roman looked at her. This woman who had walked into a frozen forest at night, found him bleeding against a tree, defied a boundary rule, spent her own healing stores, slept sitting upright in a chair to monitor his wound through the night, and was now crouching in the frost at dawn finishing the task she had originally come out for, and felt something settle in him that was not entirely comfortable. Not guilt, precisely, though it was adjacent to guilt. Something closer to the recognition of a truth he had been allowing himself not to see. "Come with me," he said. She looked up. "I beg your pardon. To the capital, as a witness. With your testimony before the council, Edric can be formally charged. The written account you sent to Westhold will constitute prior report, and your treatment of my wound will establish the timeline." He paused. "You will be under crown protection. No one will be able to silence you." Rose stared at him. For the first time since he'd met her, the composure slipped, just at the edges, just enough to show the thing underneath, which was not fear, but something raw and startled. The expression of someone who has been invisible for so long that being seen is almost more alarming than being overlooked. "I am an Omega," she said carefully, as though reminding him of something he might have forgotten. "I am aware of what you are," Roman said, "an Omega's testimony before the High Council." "Will be received," he said, and the quiet certainty in his voice was absolute. "Because the king will receive it." Rose looked at him for a long moment. The frost-pale morning light was growing, birds beginning their first tentative sounds in the pines above them. Somewhere deeper in the forest, a branch gave way under snow and fell with a soft crash. She looked down at her satchel, then back up at him. "I'll need to close up the cottage," she said finally. It was not agreement, and it was not refusal. But it was the closest thing to both that the situation had room for, and Roman recognized it for what it was. He turned back toward the cottage and began to walk, and behind him, for the second time in less than 12 hours, he heard the footsteps of Rose following. The capital of Ashenvale rose from the valley like something that had grown there rather than been built. Towers of dark stone climbing above the pine-covered hillsides, walls wide enough for 4 men to walk abreast. The great iron gates at the entrance bearing the black wolf crest that Rose had seen once on a banner years ago and never forgotten. Now she stood before it in person, and it was nothing like she had imagined. It was larger, and colder, and far less forgiving in its silence. She rode behind one of Roman's outriders on a gray mare. The king's men had found them on the valley road 2 hours after they left the cottage. 8 riders in black armor who had clearly been searching through the night with the controlled urgency of people who knew better than to show panic. The moment they found their king alive and upright, The relief on their faces was visible, though none of them spoke it aloud. They simply reformed around him, and the procession moved south toward the capital without ceremony. No one spoke to Rose. No one looked at her directly either, which was a different thing from being ignored. It was the deliberate, practiced avoidance of men who had noticed her and were carefully pretending otherwise. She kept her satchel on her lap and her eyes on the road ahead, and she did not make the mistake of thinking that crown protection meant she had ceased to be what she was, an Omega in the capital. The thought sat in her chest like a stone. The inner courtyard of the castle was all dark stone and torchlight, even in the morning. The walls so high they swallowed the pale winter sun and left the yard in a perpetual gray dusk. Grooms appeared for the horses. Guards appeared at the gate. And from the great arched entrance to the keep, a figure appeared that Rose felt before she saw, the way one feels a change in weather, a pressure in the air, a shift in temperature. The man was tall and lean, with close-cropped gray hair and sharp amber eyes that moved across the arriving party with the efficient precision of someone cataloging a situation. He wore the dark tunic and iron chain of a senior court official, and the way Roman's men instinctively straightened when he appeared told Rose everything she needed to know about his position. He was the king's first counsel. His name, she would learn shortly, was Lord Kale. He descended the entrance steps at a measured pace that managed to convey both urgency and absolute control, reached Roman, and spoke in a low voice that Rose could not fully hear, but she caught fragments. 3 hours past expected return. Search parties dispatched. The council has been asking. And then, the pause that always came when someone registered something unexpected. His amber eyes moved to her, sitting behind the outrider on the gray mare, with her worn satchel and her frost-damp cloak, and her blonde braid coming undone at the collar. The pause lasted exactly 2 seconds. Then his gaze returned to Roman with the controlled blankness of a man saving his questions for a more appropriate moment. "Arrange a room in the east wing," Roman said, as though this required no explanation. "Appropriate to a guest under crown protection. And send for the court healer. I have a wound that requires attention." Lord Kale's expression did not change. "Of course, Your Majesty," he said, but his eyes, passing briefly over Rose once more as she dismounted, held something that was not hostility and not welcome. It was the precise, watchful assessment of a man who had spent decades managing crises and had just identified a potential new one. The room they gave her was small but clean. A narrow bed with a wool blanket, a pitcher of water, a brazier already lit against the cold, and a single window looking out over the inner wall. It was a servant's room, she suspected, or something close to it, but it had a latch on the inside of the door and a candle that had not been burned down, and that was, in her current accounting, more than enough. She set her satchel on the bed and sat beside it and looked at the wall for a long moment. She thought about the cottage, about the herbs she had left hanging, the manuscripts she had locked in the chest, the fire she had banked but not fully extinguished. She had been gone less than a day, and already it felt like something she was remembering rather than something she had left. A knock at the door. "Enter," she said, and braced herself. But it was not Lord Kale, or a guard, or any of the hard-eyed men she had been composing herself to face. It was a young woman, a beta by her bearing, perhaps 19 or 20, with a round face and dark eyes that were currently attempting to arrange themselves into professional neutrality, and not quite succeeding. She was carrying a tray with bread, broth, and a cup of something warm, and she was looking at Rose with an expression that was half fascination and half the specific anxiety of someone who has been given instructions they find slightly bewildering. "The king asked that you be brought a meal," she said. She set the tray on the small table near the brazier, and then seemed to decide something, because instead of leaving immediately, she turned back and said, in a slightly lower voice, "My name is Wren. I'm to attend you while you're here." Rose looked at her. "You've been assigned to an Omega," she said, not unkindly, simply stating it plainly, so they could both acknowledge it and move past it. Wren's chin came up slightly. "I was asked by the king himself," she said, with a quiet dignity that Rose found immediately reassuring. "I don't concern myself much with ranks when the king does the asking." Rose looked at her for a moment longer, then nodded. "Thank you, Wren." The girl gave a small, slightly uncertain nod in return, and then left, pulling the door softly closed behind her. Rose ate the bread and drank the broth, which was rich with bone and onion, and something herbed she couldn't immediately identify, and she thought carefully about what came next. She had agreed to come. She had agreed to testify. She had told herself it was because justice required it, because Edric of Vorn would try again, and the next time the man bleeding in the snow might not be found by someone with a satchel full of feverwort. Those things were true, but there was another truth, quieter and more uncomfortable, that she examined only briefly before setting it aside. She had agreed to come, because when Roman had said, "I'm aware of what you are," and had kept speaking anyway, something in her chest had made a sound like ice breaking in early spring. A small, dangerous sound. The sound of something that had been frozen for a very long time, beginning to shift. She set the empty bowl aside. She needed to be careful. She knew exactly what it meant, and did not mean to be here, in this castle, under crown protection. She was a witness, and a temporary convenience, and an omega from the edge of a forest. Roman was a king who had barely looked at her during the entire journey south. She told herself this firmly. She was still telling herself this when the second knock came at the door, and she opened it to find not a servant or a guard, but Roman himself. Still in his traveling armor, the black fur at his shoulders dusty from the road, his blue eyes carrying the same alert, considering quality she had noticed the night before. The look of a man who was always assessing, always measuring, and was currently measuring her. "The court healer looked at the wound," he said. "He confirmed what you did." A pause. He was surprised. "That it worked?" Rose asked. "That an Omega healer outside the capital was practicing silver wound treatment at a level above most guild-trained healers inside it," Roman said. There was no flattery in the words. He delivered them the same way she delivered medical observations, simply and directly. Rose held the doorframe. "I've had years of practice and a great many books," she said. "That tends to compensate for formal training." "Where did the books come from?" he asked. The question was quiet, but it had weight. Books were not things Omegas were supposed to possess in quantity, and certainly not a healer's compendium, and whatever that older manuscript was that she had seen him almost touch in the cottage. She looked at him steadily. "My mother," she said. "She was a healer before me, and her mother before her." Something shifted in his expression. "What pack were they from?" "We had no pack," Rose said. "We were unaffiliated. It was safer that way." The word safer fell into the space between them, and neither of them acknowledged it directly. But it was there, small and cold and telling, the way the marks left by frost on a window pane told the story of a night's temperature long after the morning had come. Roman looked at her for a long moment. Then he said quietly, "You will not be unsafe here." It was not a promise designed to comfort. It was stated the way he stated everything, as fact, as decision, as the kind of words that came from a man who was accustomed to reality rearranging itself to match what he said. Rose should have felt reassured. Instead, she felt something far more complicated. The specific, disorienting sensation of a wall she had built very carefully, beginning to show a crack she had not authorized. "Good night, Your Majesty," she said, and gently, firmly, closed the door. She stood with her back against it for a long moment in the candlelit silence of the small room, listening to the sound of his footsteps moving away down the stone corridor. Then she sat down on the edge of the bed, pressed her hands flat against her knees, and told herself, again, more firmly this time, to be careful. But in the brazier across the room, the coals had shifted, and the light they cast was warmer than before. And outside her window, beyond the high stone wall, the first pale stars of evening were appearing in the winter sky, one by one, as though the night itself was waking up and paying attention. She disappeared on the third morning. Not in the night. That was what made it strange. Not in darkness. Not in secret. Not with the frantic haste of someone fleeing. She left at dawn, when the castle was just beginning to stir, when the kitchen fires were being lit, and the first guards were changing at the gate. She left the wool blanket folded at the foot of the bed. She left the candle burned down to its base. She left the tray from her last meal set neatly beside the door. She took only her satchel. Wren was the one who found the empty room. She stood in the doorway for a long moment, looking at the folded blanket, and the cold brazier, and the absence that had a particular quality to it. Not sudden, not violent, but deliberate. Considered. The leaving of someone who had thought about it carefully, and then done it cleanly. She went to find Lord Cale. Lord Cale went to find the king. Roman was in the great hall reviewing the morning's dispatches when Cale appeared at his shoulder and spoke in the low, precise tone he reserved for information that required immediate attention. Roman set down the parchment he was holding. He did not move for a moment. Then he said, very quietly, "When?" "Within the last hour," Cale said. "The East Gate guard reports a woman in a gray cloak passing through on foot just after the bell of first light." He did not stop her. She was not on the restricted list. Roman stood. The movement was controlled, but the energy behind it was not. "She was under crown protection," he said. "That should have been sufficient instruction for the gate." She presented herself calmly and gave no indication of distress. Cale said carefully. The guard had no reason to believe she was leaving against her will. He paused. Because she was not. The silence that followed was brief but heavy. "Send riders north," Roman said. "The valley road. She'll be on foot. She can't have gone far." He reached for his cloak. Cale did not move immediately. "Your Majesty," he said, with the careful tone of a man raising a point he knows may not be welcome. "The council convenes at midday. The matter of Lord Edric." "We'll wait," Roman said. Cale's amber eyes held steady. "She left of her own choosing," he said quietly. "Whatever her reasons." "I know why she left," Roman said, and then he said nothing more, because the words that followed that sentence were ones he was not yet prepared to examine in the presence of another person. He simply picked up his riding gloves from the table and walked toward the door. She was further than he expected. She had always walked quickly, he remembered. That first night, through the frozen forest, she had set a pace that had cost him considerably more than he'd shown. She had clearly not slowed since leaving the castle. The riders he sent ahead found her tracks easily in the frost-softened mud of the valley road, and Roman, riding hard, caught sight of her gray cloak before mid-morning, a small moving figure against the vast pale landscape, the pine forest dark on either side, the sky above a flat, cold white. He slowed as he approached. His outriders fell back without being asked. She heard the hoofbeats and stopped. She turned, and when she saw it was him, something moved across her face that she controlled almost immediately, but not quite fast enough. It was not guilt. It was something more complicated. The expression of someone who had made a decision they were certain was correct, and was now confronted with the part where the decision had consequences. He dismounted and walked to her. "You didn't say goodbye?" he said. It was not what he had intended to say. He had prepared something more practical during the ride, something about testimony, about the council, about the necessity of her presence for the formal charge against Edric. All of it dissolved the moment he was standing in front of her on the empty road, looking at her pale eyes, and the frost on her cloak, and the satchel over her shoulder. Rose looked at him steadily. "I left a note for Wren," she said. "I asked her to give the court healer instructions for reapplying the salve." "That isn't what I meant." She was quiet for a moment. The wind moved through the pines, carrying the cold smell of resin and frozen earth. Her braid had come loose again at the bottom, strands of pale gold against the gray wool of her cloak. "I gave you the name," she said finally. Lord Edric, that was what I came for. You have enough to begin the formal inquiry without me. My written account to Westhold Garrison is already on record, and your own wound is evidence of the attempt. She held his gaze. You don't need me in that castle. I disagree, Roman said. You disagree because you're accustomed to deciding what other people need, she said, and there was no sharpness in it, simply the same direct plainness she brought to everything. But I know what I am in that place. I saw the way your council looked at me in the corridor yesterday. I heard what the senior guard said to the younger one when they thought I was out of earshot. She paused. An Omega's presence at a High Council proceeding will undermine the credibility of everything you're trying to build. Edric's advocates will spend more time attacking what I am than addressing what I witnessed. I am not a help to you there. I am a liability. Roman looked at her for a long moment. You've thought about this carefully, he said. I think about most things carefully, she said. Then think about this, he said, and his voice had shifted. Lower, quieter, with the particular quality it had when he was not issuing a command but saying something he actually meant. Edric knows you treated me. His men were close enough that night. They know I survived, and they will eventually piece together why. If you go back to that cottage, you are not safe. Rose was quiet. It was a different kind of quiet than her usual composed silence. This one had texture to it, the quality of someone absorbing something they had already known, but had been hoping not to hear confirmed. I can take care of myself, she said, but the words were slightly less certain than her others had been. I know you can, Roman said. That isn't the point. She looked at him. He looked at her. The wind came through the pines again, colder this time, carrying a few dry flakes of snow that had not yet decided to fall properly. Why does it matter to you? She asked. The question was quiet and genuine, with no challenge in it. She was simply asking, the way she asked about wounds or symptoms, directly and without performance. I am no one. I am outside your pack, outside your court, outside every structure that would make my well-being your concern. You have the information you needed. You have your own healer and your own guards and a council to convene. She searched his face. Why ride out here yourself? Roman was silent for a moment. It was not a silence of avoidance. It was the silence of a man who had spent his entire life being certain of things and had encountered a question he could not answer with certainty, which was a rarer experience than anyone looking at him from the outside would have guessed. Because you were there, he said finally, when no one else was. He paused. And I am not accustomed to debts I cannot repay. Something moved in her expression. She looked down at the road, then back up at him. That's a very practical reason, she said. I am a very practical man, he said. The ghost of something crossed her face then. Not a smile exactly, but the shape of one, the suggestion of it, as though the smile existed somewhere just behind her composure and was pressing lightly against it from the inside. Your wound needs the salve tonight, she said. I know, he said, and you shouldn't ride hard for another 2 days. I'm aware. She looked at him for another long moment. Then she shifted the satchel on her shoulder and turned, not north, back toward the valley road and the cottage. She turned south, back toward the capital, back toward the dark towers rising against the white sky. She began walking. Roman stood still for a moment, watching her. Then he turned to his horse and remounted, and brought the animal to a slow walk beside her, not ahead of her, not urging her to ride, simply matching her pace. His outriders fell in behind at a respectful distance. They traveled like that in silence for a long while. The King of Ashenvale on horseback and an Omega healer on foot, moving together down the frost-pale road while snow began to fall in earnest around them, soft and quiet, settling on her gray cloak and his black fur mantle alike, making no distinction between them. It was Lord Cale who saw them return through the east gate, the king riding slow. The woman walking beside him with her satchel over her shoulder and snow in her hair, and the particular quality of silence between two people who have said something important and are still absorbing it. He stood at the top of the entrance steps and watched them cross the courtyard, and his expression, usually so carefully managed, showed, for just a moment, something that was not quite concern and not quite relief. It was the expression of a man who had served a king for 15 years and had just recognized something he had never seen in him before. He filed the observation away carefully, said nothing, and went to reschedule the council meeting for the following morning. In the east wing, Wren had already remade the bed and relit the brazier. The council chamber smelled of old candle wax, cold stone, and the particular tension that filled any room where powerful men had gathered to disagree with each other politely. Rose stood at the edge of it, not inside, not yet, and looked through the half-open door at the long oak table, the high-backed chairs, the faces of the men seated there. 8 lords. Lord Cale at the king's right hand, 2 senior warriors in full dress armor standing at the far wall, and at the far end of the table, in a chair of deep burgundy wood, Lord Edric of Vorn. He was not what she had expected. She had built him into something monstrous in her mind during the weeks since that overheard conversation in her cottage. Some dark, obvious villain with cruelty written plainly on his face. But Lord Edric was simply a man of perhaps 50 years, with iron-gray hair combed back neatly, a well-trimmed beard, and the mild, attentive expression of someone following a conversation with polite interest. He wore a fur-trimmed robe of deep green, a council ring on his left hand, and he sat with the comfortable ease of a man who had occupied that chair many times, and expected to occupy it many more. He did not look like a man who had ordered an assassination. That, Rose thought, was precisely the point. Wren touched her elbow gently. "They're ready for you," she said. Rose straightened her cloak, lifted her chin, and walked through the door. The shift in the room was immediate. Not dramatic, not loud, but present in the way a shift in wind direction is present, felt before it is understood. Heads turned. The soft murmur of side conversation ceased. One of the lords near the middle of the table, a broad man with a red beard whose name she had learned was Lord Harwick, let his eyes move from her face to Roman's with an expression that was not quite a question and not quite an accusation. Roman did not look at Harwick. He looked at Rose and gave a single small nod. She crossed to the position Cale had indicated, standing, not seated, which she had been told to expect and had accepted without complaint, and she placed her satchel on the table before her and opened it. From inside, she drew the copy of her written account she had reconstructed from memory during the 2 days since returning to the castle, inked carefully on clean parchment in her small, precise hand. "My lords," she said. Her voice was steady. She had decided, during the long, quiet hours of preparation, that she would not perform confidence she did not feel. She would simply speak clearly and let the facts carry the weight they deserved. "My name is Rose. I am a healer, unaffiliated, residing at the northern edge of the valley of Ashenvale for the past 7 years. I have a statement to give regarding events I witnessed and actions I took on the night of the new moon, 12 days past." Silence. Then Lord Harwick said, in a voice like a millstone, "This is an omega." "It is," Roman said from the head of the table. His voice was entirely calm. "The council does not receive testimony from—" "The council receives what the king determines it will receive," Roman said, still calm, still quiet, with the particular quality that Rose had come to recognize as his most dangerous register. Not raised, not sharp, simply immovable. "You will listen." Harwick's jaw tightened. He sat back. Rose began. She spoke for a long time, and she spoke carefully, the details of that night in order, the silver residue in the wound, the assessment of the blade type, what she had overheard from Edric's servant, the written account she had sent to Westhold Garrison, the garrison's response, the name of the garrison captain and the date of his refusal. She spoke without embellishment and without emotion, the same way she would present a patient's symptoms to another healer, cleanly, precisely, with every relevant detail given its proper weight. Throughout it all, she did not look at Edric. She could feel him looking at her. When she finished, the silence lasted long enough to become its own kind of statement. Then Edric spoke, and his voice was exactly as she had imagined. Smooth, measured, faintly sorrowful, like a man disappointed by the behavior of someone he had previously respected. "Your Majesty," he said, "I understand the impulse to show generosity to those of lower standing. It speaks well of your character. But surely we cannot allow the word of an unaffiliated Omega, however well-intentioned, to constitute formal evidence against a member of this council." "The garrison record constitutes formal evidence," Cale said, from Roman's right. He set a folded parchment on the table. The original response from Westhold, which Roman's men had retrieved from the garrison files 2 days prior. "The witness's account aligns with the record in every material detail. The date, the description of your retinue, the presence of silversmiths. All confirmed." Edric's smooth expression did not change, but something in his eyes did. A very small, very controlled adjustment, like a man recalculating. "Silversmiths travel for many reasons," he said. "They do," Roman agreed. "And yet the man who sharpened the blade that was used to cut me has been found in your garrison at Vorn, in the company of 3 men whose descriptions match those of my attackers." He paused. "We found him yesterday." The room went very still. Rose allowed herself then to look at Edric, and she saw it, beneath the smooth surface, beneath the measured expression and the composed hands resting on the table before him. The thing that had been there all along. Not cruelty, not madness. Something colder and more ordinary than either. Calculation. The pure, patient calculation of a man who had looked at a board and moved his pieces and had now realized for the first time that he had miscounted. His eyes moved to Rose. And in them, for just a moment, was something that was not calculation. It was recognition. The specific, ugly recognition of a powerful person looking at someone they had assumed was invisible and understanding that they were not. Rose held his gaze and did not look away. It was Edric who looked away first. The formal detention order was issued before the council session ended. Edric was escorted from the chamber by 2 of Roman's senior guards, quietly, without spectacle, the way all genuinely consequential things happen. The other lords dispersed in clusters of low conversation, the specific murmur of men rapidly reassessing their positions. Lord Harwick left without looking at Rose, which she counted as a small victory. Lord Cale lingered. When the room had emptied enough, he crossed to where Rose was gathering her parchment back into her satchel, and he stood at a respectful distance, and he said, "You gave that testimony well." Rose glanced at him. "Thank you, my lord." "I had concerns," he said, with the directness of a man who considered honesty more efficient than tact. "When the king brought you here, I want you to know that they were practical concerns, not personal ones." "I know," Rose said. "You were right to have them. An Omega witness before the High Council was always going to be a risk." "It was," Cale agreed. He was quiet for a moment. "It was also, as it turned out, the most important voice in the room." He paused again, in the way of a man choosing his next words with particular care. "You are not what I expected." "I'm aware of what most people expect," Rose said, closing her satchel. "I've spent considerable time being something else." Something shifted in Cale's amber eyes. Not quite warmth, but the thing that sometimes preceded it. "What will you do now?" he asked. "Now that the testimony is given." Rose looked at him steadily. "I had planned to return to my cottage," she said. "And now?" She looked toward the door through which Roman had left the chamber. He had been called immediately by one of his senior warriors the moment the session closed. Something about the border garrison. She had watched him go, and had noticed, as he passed the doorway, that he had glanced back at her once. Just once. The kind of glance that was trying to be something other than what it was. "I'm not entirely certain," she said honestly. Cale nodded slowly. He picked up his own folded documents from the table, tucked them under his arm, and moved toward the door. Then he paused and said, without turning around, "For what it's worth, he has not slept well since the night you left. The morning you walked out the east gate. A beat. I have served him for 15 years. I know the difference between a king who is managing a political situation and one who is managing something considerably more personal." He left before she could respond. Rose stood alone in the empty council chamber, in the smell of old wax and cold stone, and let the silence settle around her. She pressed her hand flat against the top of the oak table and looked at the grain of the wood, ancient, dark, worn smooth by decades of deliberation. She thought about the cottage, about the herbs on the shelves and the manuscripts in the chest, and the familiar weight of a life built carefully and quietly, in a place where no one asked too much of her, and she asked nothing of anyone. She thought about how it had felt when Roman said, "I am aware of what you are," and kept speaking. About his footsteps following her through the dark forest. About the look on his face on the valley road when he had said you were there, when no one else was. She thought about what it cost a man like that to say something like that. She was still thinking when the door opened again. Roman stood in the frame. He had clearly come directly from whatever the warrior had needed. There was a new tension in his jaw, something that had happened in the last half hour that hadn't been resolved. But his blue eyes, finding her across the empty room, shifted into a different register. The tension did not disappear, but it changed character, became something quieter. "The session is concluded," he said. Unnecessary information, delivered so she would know he had come back deliberately. "I know," she said. He walked into the room, stopped at the opposite side of the table from her, looked at her across the dark wood. "Edric had an ally on the border garrison," he said. "My men just confirmed it. He'd been feeding information about my travel routes for months." He paused. "The night I was in that forest, I was there because a source I trusted had told me it was the safest route back from the northern talks. That source was Edric's man." Rose absorbed this. "So you were led to that specific road," she said. "Yes. And I was in that specific forest because the only wolfsbane route within a day's walk grows near that creek bed." She paused. "And I was out at that specific hour because my patient's fever was climbing and I couldn't wait for morning." They looked at each other across the table. "Every choice had to be exactly what it was," she said quietly. "If any single thing had been different, you wouldn't have found me," he said. His voice was very low. The fire in the wall sconce crackled. Somewhere deep in the castle, a bell rang the hour. Outside the high, narrow windows, the winter light was beginning its early retreat, the sky pulling from pale gray toward the deeper blue of late afternoon. Rose looked at Roman, this impossible, immovable, quietly startling man, and felt the wall she had been rebuilding carefully since returning to the castle develop another crack, longer this time, running all the way from top to bottom. "I need to tell you something," she said. He waited. "I didn't come back from the valley road because you gave me a practical reason," she said. "The practical reason was sound, and I accepted it. But it wasn't why." She held his gaze. "I came back because when you rode out there yourself, when it was you, not a messenger, not a guard, I realized I had been wrong about something I'd been very certain of." "What were you certain of?" he asked. She looked at him. "That this was temporary," she said. "That I was a witness and a convenience, and that when it was over, I would go back to being invisible." A pause. "I'm less certain of that now." Roman was very still. Then he reached across the table, slowly, and set his hand over hers where it rested on the dark wood, not grasping, not pulling, simply covering it with a warmth and a weight that was the most deliberate thing she had ever felt. "Good," he said quietly, "because I have no intention of letting you be invisible again." Outside, the first star of evening appeared in the winter sky, and in the council chamber, beside the ancient table in the amber light of a dying afternoon. Neither of them moved for a very long time.